Good afternoon, everybody. Right now, people are just logging in, so I do want to give it a minute or two. It always takes a couple minutes for people to get into the virtual room that we have here. I hope that everybody is having a safe and healthy September. For those of you that are our students, we're delighted to have you back on the campus and back in the classroom. It's been a wonderful experience. For those members of the community that are joining us, I do hope that you're having a good September and that you're enjoying a move towards hopefully a more normal way of doing things. So for everybody online, my name is Warren Mabey and I'm the Director of the School of Policy Studies, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to this, the first in our Policy Talk series for the 2021-22 season. For those that are new to this series, we try to bring people into our virtual rooms or ultimately onto campus throughout the year who can talk about a variety of different policy issues and a variety of different policy concerns. And we've had a wide range of speakers over many years that we've been doing this. It's a terrific opportunity to learn something about what's going on in our country and in the world. It's a terrific opportunity to dive deep into some of the policy issues which our society faces. Before I start this lecture off, I do want to acknowledge that I'm sitting here at Queen's University, and Queen's University is on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. It is a privilege to be able to work here and to live here and to study here. Cataraqui or Kingston has long been a meeting place, where people have come together to hunt, to fish, to meet, to talk. Queen's University is a place where we can do some of that. We can talk, we can learn from each other, we can interact. As I say, it is a privilege to be here. The virtual nature of this talk means that you, our audience, may be in many different places, many different traditional or unceded territories. Please take a moment yourselves to think about that and to recognize those that came before. It is my great privilege to introduce our speaker for today. Professor Watts, Bob Watts, is an expert in Indigenous policy, in negotiations, training. He is the former Interim Executive Director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He's been the Chief of Staff to the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. He has worked as an Assistant Deputy Minister for the Government of Canada. He has deep experience working in these areas, and he's very kindly agreed to be with us today and to talk about the move towards a National Day of Reconciliation. So, Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm really looking forward to your talk and to the questions that come afterwards. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Warren, and thank you for that really beautiful land acknowledgement. It's great to be on campus. It's great to be back in these traditional territories. I spent the first few years of my life just down the road here in at Tyendinaga, so in Mohawk territory, and it's always nice to be back in this area. So I'm really delighted to be able to talk about this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about a way that I like to look at policy and issues, whether or not they're symbolic or substantive or systemic, and trying to think through those three paradigms, and not that they're sequential. I think all three could be happening at the same time, and I chose to think about symbolic and systemic in terms of this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So maybe by way of getting started, I'll just give a bit of a definition that I think might be helpful in terms of thinking through this. So symbolic, and One of the dictionaries talks about symbolic as being characterized by symbolism, and symbolism exhibiting a symbol or association. But the one that really caught my eye was this, a visible sign of something invisible. And I really like that, because at times there's things that we can think about in terms of this journey of reconciliation that may be purely political, may be legal, and then there's a mysterious part of reconciliation. Maybe some might call it spiritual, some might have other words, but it's an energy and it's a force. And so it may be that something that is invisible. I worry if something is kind of stuck at being purely symbolic, that folks might think it's performative and maybe tokenistic. And there's, I think, a real danger of being stuck in things that are purely symbolic. So the idea of having other things going on at the same time that may address substantive change or systemic change is always something to be thinking about. And in terms of systemic, the way I think about it is some of those things that may be fundamental to predominant social, economic, or political practices. One of the examples of that was this idea that you might encounter a fork in the road or a decision to either continue on the path of systemic racism or confront our past history. And I think that kind of helps frame in some ways what we're talking about in terms of systemic and in terms of reconciliation. Michaela Jean, when she was Governor General, she talked about that need to confront history together, that's part of rebuilding this nation. And so this day might remind us again that we are at that fork in the road, and really maybe thinking through how far have we moved on that path of reconciliation. I wanted to just give a really short snapshot of how we got here. And in doing so, I want to acknowledge residential school survivors and their families and their communities, and to talk about kind of my framing in terms of when I talk about these issues. One of the things that I'm guided by is this idea, and we had talked about that when we were negotiating the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. The idea that it shouldn't be framed in terms of name, shame, and blame. And I've heard elders talk about that, talking about what are some of those things that are foundational to reconciliation. And many elders saying, naming, shaming, and blaming may not be really strong foundations to reconciliation. In particular, if we're saying things in a way or doing things in a way that, the present generation of people that we're neighbors with and living with, that we try to make them ashamed of themselves. Because that's not the purpose. Being able to critically examine and with open eyes and fairness and honesty some of our past as a country and the associated legacy with that is really important. So I think it's important in terms of legacy that we kind of take a step back, and some of this step is kind of a really big one for me, but it really talks about some of those initial relationships and assumptions about Indigenous people, and even questioning whether or not as Indigenous people we were human beings or not, and what was the doctrines that guided Europeans in terms of conquest or claiming our land, our ownership of our land, and some of that embedded in the doctrine of discovery. One of the things that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, by the way, asked churches and governments to disavow that doctrine of discovery because of the inherent racism within that doctrine. But fundamentally, it it has framed a lot of the relationship that we've had with each other as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. This idea, sort of this childlike image of Indigenous people, infantilizing Indigenous people, and putting settlers or colonists sort of in this position of the father or of the mother, and that we were infant-like, which is contrary to everything that people experienced when they came here. They witnessed some of the great cultures that had manifest themselves right across North America, some of the great civilizations, but we were called uncivilized. That the forms of architecture and engineering and lawmaking that were instructive to the colonists in terms of how they might want to design their own societies and their own institutions. In particular, we think about the US Constitution and founding fathers from that effort, meeting with the Haudenosaunee people to understand that great law of peace and how that Haudenosaunee or European Constitution might help those founding fathers think about democracy and think about relationship between individual and collective rights. But a lot of that initial thinking and perhaps cooperation and principles of non-interference embedded in things like the Swenta, the Tula Wampum, that we're not to interfere with each other. And we're going to be joined together, our ship and our canoe joined together in friendship and in peace forever. That those things fell to the wayside as folks that settled here became more and more imperialistic in terms of their attitude, bringing some of those structures that they fled from, bringing them to America and imposing it on us as Indigenous people. So that's part of our legacy. When we entered into treaty with each other, some of those founding documents for the formation of what we now know as Canada, whether they're peace and friendship treaties or other types of treaties, we see education as part of that treaty-making process. And there was many experiments in education. One of them, just prior to residential schools, were industrial schools. But the purpose, from an Indigenous point of view, was to ensure that our people had a chance to be able to compete, if you will, with broader society, to be able to get jobs, to be able to cooperate, to be able to do all of those things. The purpose of the colonists in terms of education was to Christianize, aggressively assimilate, and civilize Indigenous people. And this is part of what all these many experiments in education were part of. So the industrial schools, which were in place kind of immediately prior to residential schools, that was part of that purpose, to Christianize, civilize, and assimilate Indigenous people. And when I say Indigenous, we're talking about First Nation people, Inuit people, and Métis people that all were subject to various experiments in terms of education. One of the things that, and these schools were a joint venture or a collaborative effort between the churches and the federal government. One of the things that some of the church leaders wrote to government about, and there's the letters in the archives on this, they said that the wigwam was stronger than the classroom, which meant that all the good work being done during the day to aggressively assimilate, civilize, and Christianize Indigenous children were being undone at night when children went home to their parents, to their siblings, to their extended family. And so if the purpose is to do that Christianization and assimilation, civilization, then children needed to be removed from the influence of their family. So that idea of residential schools was born out of that. So residential schools, first residential schools started in 1938 in Brantford, Ontario, Mohawk Institute. Last school closed in 1996. So not that long ago, but this legacy of residential schools continues to today. The intergenerational impact of residential school through trauma, through other legacies continue to be foundational for many pathologies that we find in Indigenous communities. And I don't want to sort of posit this kind of in a deficit paradigm, because there's so many stories of resilience and resiliency in Indigenous communities that's important to talk about. But it's also important to understand that there is a legacy of residential school that's really harmful, and residential schools themselves being harmful. So enrollment was mandatory for First Nation children. Sometimes kids as young as 4 years old, sometimes 3 years old, were removed from their families and sent to residential school, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away from home. But 150,000 children went through these residential schools. And again, the purpose I've already stated, but there is an underlying purpose that Stephen Harper talked about in his apology in 2008. And he articulated what had been said for decades and decades, that the underlying purpose of residential schools was to kill the Indian in the child. That there was something so abhorrent with Indianness that it had to be taken out of those children. In the United States, they said, kill the Indian, save the man. In Canada, there's been so much of our focus, our government focus on Indigenous people, on children, whether it was residential schools or the 60s school, Indian day schools, have all been directed at that, at children, and stopping that transmission of Indigenous values, culture, and spiritualities from one generation to the next. That's been part of that lived experience, the attack on children and the attack on Indigenous women through the Indian Act. So this is part of what we're trying to come to grips with and sorting through when we're talking about National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And some of these truths are really hard. I know, when I started teaching courses here at Queen's on reconciliation, it was about 10 years ago when I first started doing that. And folks like the CBC and others really hadn't picked up the work of the TRC and residential schools more generally, like we hear in conversation now and we have heard over the last number of years. So I see people, and I think this is true of the country more generally, people going through saying, well, there's no way that this could have happened and I didn't know about it. That surely somebody who ends up here at graduate school would have heard about this, and people just thinking, no, there's no way that could have happened. And then coming to grips with the fact that this did happen. And some people would go from that acceptance to it happened to anger over the fact that it happened and they didn't know about it. And maybe being upset with their undergrad profs or their high school teacher, their priest, their minister, their others, religious instructors, maybe their parents. Why did nobody tell me about this? And then moving to, we got to do something about this, and coming up with those ideas. And then for many, many people acting on those ideas. And like I keep in touch with many of my former students, and when I hear back some of the incredible things that people are doing, I'm really happy, because it talks sort of about that breadth of support that we're going to need in this country to enable reconciliation to happen. And some people just change their mind. Some people may tell their families. Some people may be in a position where they can influence huge change, whether within a government institution or corporate Canada or NGOs. So there's people that are out there doing some of this work of reconciliation at whatever level they can and however they can seek to influence. But these residential schools, some of them had terrible histories of abuse. There were some schools that had very high death rates, in particular decades. Some schools with as high as 50% mortality rate in particular decades, not over the entire breadth of the residential school experience, but sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse happening in schools right across the country. And it doesn't mean that everybody that worked at residential schools were evil. There are some really good people, and the TRC heard from some of those people, and other people have talked about this. You know, folks that really sought to protect the children and to ensure that they were taken care of, to make sure they had adequate nutrition, or just generally taken care of. But there was a lot of terrible things that were done in these institutions. So over the last number of years, we've been through the efforts of survivors starting to come forward and talking about disclosing their own stories, coming together in class action lawsuits or individual lawsuits to pursue the federal government and churches to hold them to account. This momentum was going on. At one point, there was over 10,000 individual actions and I think 7 class action lawsuits. And efforts were made to combine these lawsuits into one sort of mega class action lawsuit. And out of that was born the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, which talked about individual compensation, a process outside of court to be able to resolve claims of sexual abuse and serious physical abuse, commemoration, and significantly, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The first world Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and one that was specifically talking about the human rights violations of children. I think as Canada, we owe a huge debt to those survivors and their supporters and allies and families that ensured that these types of processes were put in place. And to those commissioners that worked so hard and to ensure that truth-telling could happen, and to help the country understand that, and to lay out ideas through those 94 calls to action on how we can move forward as a country. Former Senator Murray Sinclair, Marie Wilson, Chief Willie Littlechild, I think the country owes a tremendous debt to these commissioners for their bravery and sacrifice and creating that safe place for people to be able to tell their stories, to be able to disclose their stories that maybe they had never told anybody else, maybe not their partner, their children, their best friend. So this is part of that history of moving forward. The TRC putting in place opportunities for researchers to better understand that residential school era and finding out about things like nutritional experiments that were happening on children in residential schools. And coming out with with a report that talked about cultural genocide. And I think that was a real shocker and wake-up call for Canada. I know when I was working at with really an amazing team helping to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we'd go out and we'd talk to folks, and people would say, well, you know, things were tough when I went to school too. But I think we've, as a country, started to understand that this experience of residential schools was unlike anything else that we've witnessed in this country. And I think that since May 27th, when those truths about those unmarked graves and recovered graves and remains of those children in Kamloops, when that made it into the news, and that news carried all over the world. When you Google Kamloops residential schools, you can find headlines from Australia, from France, from the United States, from Great Britain, from all over the world. And that's continued. And I think that as a country, we've witnessed grief, we've witnessed bewilderment, we've witnessed anger, and we've witnessed determination. One of the things that I think about is that this incredible power, the spirits of those children from all these different residential schools, that they're really helping to guide us and to move us forward in terms of understanding truth, but also helping to create that environment for us to be able to have conversations about what does this future look like. We need to take care of those children, and communities are doing that through ceremony, through repatriation, through their own cultural and spiritual understandings. And we need to create space for that, and create understanding for that, and ensure that efforts that are being made by communities, whether it's wanting to, through ceremony, take care of those children, or through investigation to understand whether or not criminal charges should be pursued against people. We need to create space for that and to be able to support the efforts of community as they deal with these issues where there's not a whole lot of guidance out there on how to deal with some of these things. And but we support understanding, respect, and kindness and generosity are probably some keys that all of us in this country can use to help create that environment, that safe place to be able to understand this. So the TRC called this cultural genocide. And what that talked about, there's a lot of different types of genocide that get talked about in both legal and academic literature. And cultural genocide is one of those things. And there's a number of parts to that definition in terms of land being seized, people being forcibly transferred, languages banned, spiritual leaders persecuted, spiritual practices forbidden. Some of these were law in Canada. But most significantly, the TRC said, to the issue at hand, families are disrupted to prevent the transmission of cultural values and identity from one generation to the next. And TRC said, in its dealing with Indigenous peoples, Canada did all of these things. So that's the paradigm, part of the paradigm that we're working within, is understanding that cultural genocide and that impact of cultural genocide intergenerationally. And how do we move forward by respecting that's this legacy. And what does that mean in terms of reconciliation? And reconciliation is not such an easy thing. I don't know if there's any one definition that really speaks to what reconciliation is. But the TRC again helped us in this way. TRC said that reconciliation is an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships at all levels of Canadian society. That's what those 94 calls to action talk about. And here's some of the requirements the TRC talked about. A new vision based on commitment to mutual respect, understanding of the most harmful aspects and impacts of residential schools. Some of those impacts have been loss of pride and self-respect for Indigenous peoples, and lack of respect that Canadians have been raised to have for Indigenous neighbors. These are all things that we need to grapple with. And significantly, the TRC said reconciliation is not an Indigenous issue. It's a Canadian one. I think about it as a Canadian opportunity. But it's not a burden that we place on the shoulders of Indigenous people to figure out reconciliation. So Mikhail Jean, I mentioned before, really talked about this opportunity that we've been given, the opportunity to right historical wrongs. She said that's what truth and reconciliation is about. It's kind of a refounding of our nation. And I think that's going to happen. I think it's inevitable that that's part of this journey of reconciliation, is us figuring out what does that mean for us as a nation? What does sort of a post-colonial Canada look like? So things like Truth and Reconciliation Day isn't something that's just performative or purely symbolic, that there are systemic and substantive changes that are required in terms of manifesting reconciliation. Prime Minister Trudeau said no relationship is more important to Canada than the relationship with Indigenous peoples. How do we manifest that? How do we manifest that most important relationship in terms of power sharing, in terms of resource revenue sharing, in terms of Indigenous people also having their hands on the fiscal levers that drive decision-making in terms of how money is spent in Canada, how laws are developed. These are some of the challenges that I think that we have. We've been on a bit of a healing journey together for a number of years. We've seen apologies from a number of the churches. One of the apologies from the Anglican Church really sticks with me, where the primate, Fred Hiltz, he said to residential school survivors and to their families, he said, "We failed you, we failed God, and we failed ourselves." And I was talking to him about that. I said, "Well, like, just say you failed God. That's pretty incredible." He said, "We have to say that. One, because that's what we did, but two, to drive home the importance for our congregation in terms of that work that we need to do and that work that we need to support in terms of reconciliation." In 2008, part of Prime Minister Harper's apology, he said to the survivors and to their families, he said, "You've been carrying this burden for far too long. It's time for us to carry that burden." But I didn't witness that happen. Didn't witness it happen. In fact, in some ways, I think we may have moved a little bit backwards during that time. But I don't think reconciliation is kind of a straight path either. I think it's kind of like waves in the ocean. Sometimes you're on top, and sometimes, things dip. And I think that's what the road of reconciliation is like. And so we need to be patient with each other. We need to find ways of grappling with the past, but also finding ways of creating that future for our children. I was on a panel the other day with the niece of Cheney Winjack, whose name is associated with the Downey Winjack Fund. And just put in a plug for that fund. I'm the chair of the fund, and being here in Kingston, it's hard not to think of Gord Downey. and Gord Downey encouraging us all to do something. He didn't kind of lay out a roadmap. He just said, do something. And we all have different abilities and to do something. But thinking about that, to me, maybe that's what September 30th is about. It's about reflecting on how we got here. And maybe making a plan on doing something so that when we come to September 30th, 2022, we have some great stories to share with each other on what we did, how we help create a better future for our children and our grandchildren. To me, that's part of that test is, are we doing things? Do we have the capacity? Are we acting within our capacities that when our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren look at those things that we've done, that they would be proud of us? So the niece, Harriet, the niece of Cheney Winjack, we were on this panel and she said, you know, it's easy to be cynical. She says, I have a beautiful daughter and she looks at the world differently than I do. She said, so one of the things I try doing is I try to look at the world through my daughter's eyes. And she said, and you know, my daughter looks at the world through her heart. So then I imagined, what would it be like to look at the world through my daughter's heart? And what change will that make in my heart in terms of how I look at the world? I just think that's such a beautiful teaching. How we can look at the world and how we can shape things within our own abilities. And you know, this road of reconciliation is going to be tough. There's people that don't believe in it. I was on a panel a couple of years ago at University of Western Ontario, and one of the professors said that I looked at the world through rose-colored glasses, and that reconciliation was not going to happen. I said, so what do you think about that? And I said, well, let me tell you a quick story. And I said, this is from when I was working at the Assembly of First Nations. And we had been invited to the opening of a residential school exhibit at Library and Archives Canada. And so it was a Monday morning. I got there kind of early because I thought they might have some really good coffee and treats for folks, but they didn't. But anyway, so I'm sitting there and one of my colleagues comes and sits beside me. And we exchanged greetings and he goes, Bob, he says, I got to tell you something that happened on the weekend. I said, what happened? He said, I told my daughter I loved her. I said, that's really nice. That's great. He goes, no, you don't understand. He said, I told her I loved her for the first time. He was about 60 and she was about 30. Really? The first time? And he goes, yeah. He goes, you know, he said, my grandparents went to residential school. My parents went to residential school. I went to residential school. Nobody ever told me they loved me. He said, I didn't really understand that that was part of the deal, being a parent. He said, but when I saw her reaction and I felt the way that I felt and continue to feel, he says, I'm just going to tell her I love her all the time. And so I said, to me, that's reconciliation. Is it going to show up on the front page of the Globe and Mail? Probably not. Is it going to change the relationship between that man and his daughter? For sure. Between her and her kids? For sure. Between their family, maybe their community, maybe their region. We don't know how far these positive energies continue. I said, but one thing I'm pretty confident of is there's hundreds and maybe thousands of little reconciliations happening all the time in this country. What we're doing today is a little tiny reconciliation, I think. And they all have energy associated with them. They all have legacy. They all have opportunity. And over time, we're going to recognize this energy, and it's going to create a profound change for our country. I really think that reconciliation is inevitable, and it's really up to us to figure out how difficult or how easy that journey of reconciliation is going to be. Lots of hurdles, there's no question about that. How we think of our country, what does a post-colonial Canada look like? What does settler colonization look like? I just said in a class I was in earlier today that Indigenous people aren't looking for sort of a kinder and gentler form of colonization. We're looking for dramatic change. We're looking for what the TRC talked about as being essential to that road to reconciliation, the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which talks about Indigenous people as self-governing, self-determining peoples, but also having a share of the wealth of this country, so that 50% of our kids aren't growing up in poverty. So how we do that is in our hands. How we do settler colonization is in our hands to shape. And again, I don't think it'll be easy. Some of those institutions that we're talking about are really strive. One of the first things they do is figure out how to protect themselves. But they're going to have to insert a bit of humility into how they think about themselves and a bit of vulnerability in terms of how we move forward. It's going to require incredible leadership from Indigenous, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, putting children, putting future generations, those coming faces, our children and our grandchildren, great-grandchildren at the center of that circle, and thinking about how those decisions that we're making today, whether it's from like a 7 generations point of view or other ways of thinking, but how do we put those children at the center of that circle? So decisions that we're making really help create a beautiful world for them to inherit. That's something that all of us have in common. So I want to maybe close, because as Warren said, it'd be nice to have some time for some questions. I'll just leave off with a couple things. You know, I mentioned Gord Downey. He said the next 100 years are going to be painful as we come to know Cheney Winjack and thousands like him, as we find out about ourselves, about all of us. But only when we do that can we truly call ourselves Canada. So that's part of our journey. When we're setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we had a conference out in Alberta and invited experts from all over the world, people that have worked on TRCs, to come and share their experience so we could learn from the rest of the world in terms of what we were designing here in Canada. And 2 things we got told was that there is no real template for Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, that it grows, it's kind of holistic, it's reflective of the people that it's meant to serve. But we're also told by Paul Chartrand, a wonderful Métis scholar. He studied about TRCs. And one of the things he said was that Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are like spring ice, maybe like fall ice too. You know, when you go out cold in the morning and maybe there's a puddle or you got a little creek or something near your house and there's that really thin ice there. And maybe like if you're too rough and you try to pick it up, it just crumbles in your hand. But what he said is that we can bring a whole bunch of hands together and gently lift up that spring ice, hold it up to the sun, that this beautiful spectrum gets revealed to all of us, and we're all bathed in these beautiful colors. And he said, and to me, that talks about love, and that talks about kindness. But if anyone tries to grab it for themselves, and it crumbles in everybody's hand. So I think about that both for the TRC, but also for those powerful 94 calls to action. It's going to take all of us putting our hands together in cooperation, in humility, in gentleness, in love for our objectives, and hold that spring ice, those calls to action up, so that beauty can be shed upon all of us and continue to be shed as a beacon for future generations. I want to thank you very much for being able to spend some time with you. Chinigwech, Yawagoa, thank you, merci.
Bob, thank you so much. Whenever Professor Watts is able to speak to us and to give us some of his thoughts and his lessons and his experience, I always come away a little bit sobered by the challenge, but I also come away with some optimism. I start to see that there are things that can be done and there are ways forward that we can follow. So I really appreciate that. I think I learn a lot every time I listen to you, and I just want to thank you for taking time today to do this. We have a couple of ways that you can ask questions for those of you that are online. We have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click that. I know that one person's already found it. You may also put a comment or a question into the chat, and I'm going to work our way through and make sure that we get through as many questions as we can in the next 15 minutes or so. So the first is in our chats. I don't know who asked this, but it says, as one of many non-Indigenous inhabitants of Turtle Island, I would like to take tangible action to ensure that the recommendations of the TRC are followed through by the government. What do you suggest is the best course of action we can take to ensure this happens? Letter writing seems to have been ineffectual thus far. Bob, I turn to you.
Great. I think that's a great question. I think there's things that we can be doing, like in our own space, in our own family, in our own community, that all help to create, that good foundation for reconciliation. But of course, I think, as inherent in that question is there's big institutional changes that need to happen too. And I can tell you from working in Ottawa for a number of years, I've had times where ministers would say, sort of asking, is there, what is the one thing we can do to make things better? That one thing really has a whole bunch of subcategories. And then some would say, Bob, that I'd work on this a lot harder, but it doesn't appear to be something that's important for my constituents. And I really try to represent my constituents. And I said, you can also think about representing what the Supreme Court talked about, and that was the honor of the crown. And you're part of that crown as a minister. So your honor is at stake. It's not just what your constituents like or don't like or say or don't say. That honor is at stake in this. And that honor really represents all of our honor. I have a really good friend. He said, I can't do a whole lot, but when I meet a politician or they come asking for my vote, I ask them, what are you going to do about reconciliation? And I'm a Catholic. He said, and when I go and as a priest is going to give me that post, I say, tell the Pope to apologize for residential schools. He goes, I can't do too much, but I know I can do that every chance I get, and I do. So there's things that all of us can do, but I think holding politicians to account and making sure that they understand that you as the voting public hold this as a significant issue for Canada to work on will, I think, energize them to be more proactive in terms of their roles in Ottawa or in Toronto or other capitals across the country.
Bob, thanks so much for that. We have a question that's come from Sharon. What do you say to people in the Indigenous community who are cynical to reconciliation and who believe that reconciliation will never happen between them in the Indigenous communities and the government?
That's a really good question. I think it's one of those really difficult questions. There's been such a history of distrust and of broken promises and of outright lies and stolen land. So this is part of what we're inheriting. So I think it's, hopes have been raised many times. So when folks say, I'm not really sure about this, it's built on experience. So I think that one of the things that all of us can do is to sometimes, I think it's going to be like baby steps, but to be able to find those things that are consistent with reconciliation, and part of reconciliation, find ways of celebrating those and demonstrating those. The government may act one way, and we can be cynical about that. Some corporations may too. But there's consistent polling in this country that said Canadians really support reconciliation. Recent polling says Canadians believe that genocide happened in this country. So there's so much support out there. And how that support sort of gets manifest in terms of the action of various governments is going to be really key to dealing with that. It's not with that mistrust and distrust that things are actually going to move forward.
Thank you for that. I've got a question. Well, actually, I want to read this. Mark Green, who is our provost, has just posted a comment saying, for anyone at Queen's who wants to know how to take action, I would recommend to read the Queen's TRC Task Force report, which is available. And if I get a chance, I'll put the link up. See if there are any actions that you can take in your unit to support the recommendations. And, Mark, thanks so much for that comment. It is a great comment. And the one thing I would add is that for those of you that are not from the Queen's community, and if you haven't done it, please do look at the TRC reports and the recommendations. Familiarize yourself with that, because there are opportunities for all of us to do things that are in there, and it takes some time to look at them, but once you've looked at them, you start to see some of these paths forward.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that, Warren, I think that's absolutely true. I appreciate Mark weighing in. I have a ton of respect for Mark Green. And there are resources out there, like the task force report. Actually, the Chamber of Commerce from Saskatoon has a really great webpage on this with lots of resources. Downey Winjack Fund webpage has lots of resources for things that we could be thinking about as individuals, as families, as collectivities. And that's part of those 94 calls to action too. They weren't just all directed at government. They're directed at all of us in terms of the various capacities and abilities that we have.
And Heather has posted a note asking basically this question: as a non-Indigenous person, do you have suggestions for ways that I can actively provide allyship to our Indigenous peoples? We've answered that to some extent, but if you have anything to add, Bob.
Yeah, I think reaching out to community, whether it's things like at Queen's here, Four Directions Center, or Native Friendship Centers, or Indigenous Friendship Centers, Indigenous women's organizations, to volunteer, to help fundraise for them. Most of them are sort of in a constant state of fundraising. To buy Indigenous. I mean, there's a kind of a thriving Indigenous economy out there, but still needs lots of help. Buy Indigenous. And to continue, I think, to much like this question talks about, is to be reflective about your role as an ally and what that means on an ongoing basis. That's the type of thing that I think really helps create some of these powerful foundations for moving forward.
Thank you. We have a question. I'm not sure who asked this one, and it might be a big question. Let's pose it and see what we can do with it. In micro interactions in the workplace, it seems to be a precarious balance between creating space for Indigenous voices and not placing the expectation that they share lived experiences and give us non-Indigenous people, all of us, the answers. What are your reflections on this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's part of that idea of like putting the burden on Indigenous people to do reconciliation, and I think it's patently unfair. And there's Indigenous people that may be able to come and talk to your organization, but to look at Indigenous colleagues and to say, it's up to you to teach us all about, trauma or drama or legacy is just patently unfair. I think having those conversations with employees about what are some resources out there that we could utilize to help us understand some of these issues better is probably a far better approach than putting the emotional burden on Indigenous people to do this work. And if I have a really good friend. He writes to me the other day. He goes, can you recommend a good Indigenous restaurant in my area? We want to have. I think, oh my God, he's probably got 10 assistants. And and I don't even live in that city. I'm thinking, come on, there's Google, do something yourself. And so I said, sorry, I don't live there. I'm not sure. Maybe do some research.
Well, this is a great thought, and I'm going to ask this last question, I think, from Valerie, and then we'll probably be at the end of our time. Valerie writes, a very encouraging and optimistic talking discussion. Coming from the Anglican Church, I'm particularly thankful for the efforts to be educated and grow in reconciliation. So thank you for today. I think it's a great thought to share. I share those thoughts, Valerie. I think that it's been great to get into these topics and to have an opportunity to go back and forth. A couple things I will say to our audience members is that we record these sessions. So these sessions are posted and you can go back and watch them, or you can share the links with other members of your community or your network. You can find them through the homepage for the School of Policy Studies. So please do share these on. We do meet on a very regular basis for these types of policy talks, and we cover a wide range of issues. So we will be coming back and addressing some of these issues, particularly over the course of the year. Do keep an eye on our upcoming events, and we'll be able to keep you in the loop. There has been a question posed here, but we're right at the very end of our time. So Bob, I'm not sure if you want to take this on. I live in a Six Nations community called Iroquois. We recently received government money to repaint our water towers. The tower here in Iroquois used to display a chief head painting. I believe that's the headdress painting that was designed by an Indigenous person for the purpose of the tower to recognize the land we live on. When the township decided to remove the painting permanently, there was many that spoke up. One was an Indigenous community asking the township to reconsider. Another nation said, no, it was cultural appropriation, should not be replaced. I'm confused by the difference or the disagreements. I think that this question gets at some of the challenge, the messiness of this. But Bob, do you have any last words before we have to wrap up?
That's kind of a tough one to jump into. I really being thoughtful, I think, about the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation is really important. But I think, there's Indigenous communities have different histories and different understandings. There's very few things that one could point to and say, well, this is, the Indigenous way. And I think that's true for much of Canada about how different Alberta is from Quebec. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's difference of opinion. I think, creating opportunity and a safe place to be able to work through and talk through some of these things. There may be other ways of showing appreciation for Indigenous people that might be acceptable to everybody in that area. But I think, again, that relationship building needs to be done. And sometimes Indigenous and non-Indigenous neighbors that have lived beside each other for hundreds of years have had very little communication with each other, especially on a government to government basis. Maybe we may shop in town sort of thing, but now we have other challenges that we have to sort through. So trust building and relationship building are probably a couple of real keys to sorting through that.
Thank you for that, Bob. And it does get to the fact that reconciliation is not just one answer. It's not just one thing to do. Many, many actions need to be taken and they may be different in different places at different times. So it is a journey, a process. We're part of this process. Bob, I want to thank you so much for allowing us to talk about it and giving us your insights on this. It's been really wonderful. I want to remind everybody online that September 30th is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And I hope you'll take some time to recognize that as we go through. Certainly Queen's University will be. And I hope to see many of you on future calls. So with that, thank you so much to our speaker, Professor Watts. Thank you so much to our audience, and have a great day.